Once upon a time, a long time ago, is a familiar phrase used to introduce tales of mystery and or legend. Such an introduction would befit the story that we know and have always known as the Charter of Barbados.
It was an unusual moment in our colonial past when this little island openly defied His Majesty's strong imperial powers. Our actions back then informed what is often described as an iconic event in American history, the Great Boston Tea Party of 1773. It had a direct influence on the Declaration of the United States independence. It also informed the writing of that nation's constitution, so much so that if it were done today, we could easily invoke the question of copyright. Now for Barbados, it was finally crystallized at the stroke of midnight, November the 29th, 1966 on the Garrison Savannah. Hello, I'm Sherwood McCaskey, welcoming you to a piece of our past, the signing of the Charter of Barbados way back on Thursday, January the 11th, 1652, in the Mermaid Tavern, which was situated right here in what was known then as Charlestown on Oistins Bay. As always, we will begin by placing things in the correct perspective.
Between 1642 and 1646, England was torn apart by a bloody civil war. At the heart of the conflict lay the policies and personality of King Charles I and his apparent determination to rule England without the assistance of Parliament. On one side stood the supporters of the king, the royalists. On the other side stood the supporters of the rights and privileges of Parliament, the parliamentarians. Both sides had supporters in Barbados. A substantial number of Englishmen came to this island to escape from the conflict, but brought their politics with them. For some years, uneasy neutrality was preserved in Barbados, and the island refused to give any definite support to either of the two sides in England enjoying a virtual independence. In England, the king was defeated. Attempts at any sort of compromise failed, and he was tried for treason and executed by authority of Parliament in January 1649. The supporters of the Royalist cause won control of Barbados. In May 1650, the late king's son Charles II was solemnly proclaimed as king. Almost immediately afterwards, there arrived in Bridgetown Francis Lord Willoughby, who had obtained both a lease of the proprietary rights of the 2nd Earl of Carlisle and a commission as governor of Barbados from Charles II, who was living in exile in Holland. This rather startled the leading royalists in the island, who had been expecting to run things for themselves, but Willoughby was able to establish his authority. The situation was unacceptable to the English Parliament, which had proclaimed the country a republic after the execution of Charles I. The Parliament ordered a fleet under the command of Sir George Askew to subdue the island. There were long delays, and Askew's fleet did not reach Barbados until October 1651.
Now, the fleet was sent out from England. At first landed parties ashore in the area of Speightstown. Land battles were fought there. A couple of hundred people were killed in them. But the island was defended so strongly that the raiding parties had to withdraw.
But the militia was so strong in Barbados, and the guns like this, were so powerful that he was driven back to his ships. He tried Hull Town, he was driven back to his ship. He tried Speightstown, was driven back to his ships. And so he couldn't land. And he went up and down the coast for a couple of months and couldn't land.
and then they came around to Oistins and anchored in Oistins here in this bay.
The entire area around is a hotbed for war. From Charlestown, Oistins Bay to this point, over 200 men are assembled. They are about to wage war against the Roundheads and defend their island.
In the meantime, the Barbadian forces gather on the cliffs overlooking Oistins, the town of Oistins, and they were preparing for a massive land battle. And at that point in time, it would have been a pretty large battle because the forces defending Barbados counted about 2,000 foot soldiers and about 400 cavalry men, and the forces opposing them, the Commonwealth forces, and those forces on the island that were loyal to the cause of Parliament, their numbers were to approximately 2,000 men, and they had less horse, 100 horsemen. So Willoughby, who was in charge of the local forces, decided that with his strength in horse cavalry, he would initiate an attack on the parliamentary forces.
But that was not to be, for there was an interesting turn of events which interrupted the War of Council that was occurring right here on the hill with the Cavaliers.
But he was foiled in that because just up there where the fort of Oistins is located, the parliamentary forces had managed to persuade the gunners of that fort to support their side in this struggle. And the guns of the fort then were turned around and pointed inland and fired at the Barbadian party. And they were actually having a council of war up there on these hills when a cannonball from one of these guns at Oistins Fort took the head off completely of the sentinel at the door, burst open the door to the council room and injured some of the members inside. Then this battle was prepared for, the mother of all battles in a Barbadian context.
An element of precipitation was present, notably the rain, and that turn of events turned even further.
Mother Nature, or perhaps the hand of God, Providence, stepped in. It rained very heavily, and it rained so heavily that the ground became so muddy that they couldn't move the heavy cannon. So neither side had a real advantage over the other. And then wiser minds and counsel prevailed.
Two of the commanders of the local regiments went to Lord Willoughby, the governor, and said, look, if you don't come to an agreement with Cromwell's Admiral Askew, with Cromwell's representative there, we're going to turn our troops over to him.
And it was decided then that they would deliberate and come to some compromise or agreement rather than resort to warfare, which would essentially have destroyed all of Barbados at a point in time when Barbados was poised to move into the plantation economy stage, which it had not yet done, but as I said, was on the point of doing so. The island would have been set back perhaps 100 years, and it would never have become what it was touted in the 17th century as being, which is, quote unquote, the richest spot of ground in the world. So, as I said, wiser counsels prevailed.
And so Lord Willoughby had no alternative but to meet up with Admiral Askew, and they met in the Mermaid Tavern in Oistins, and they signed the Charter of Barbados.
And they came down here to the Mermaid Tavern, which, to the best of my knowledge, nobody is positive of the exact location now because so much of the landscape has been changed. But from information that I received from other people, the Mermaid Tavern was located not far from here by the roadside, but to the best of my understanding, it was on the seaside rather than on the land side. But nevertheless, the parliamentary forces and the Barbadian forces met here at the Mermaid Tavern, and agreed to a surrender of the island, but not everything was surrendered because the Barbadians fought hard to retain some of their old privileges. And out of these deliberations came the Charter of Barbados.
And that charter reads like the Magna Carta in England: every man shall have a vote, no man shall be taxed without consent of Parliament. And in fact, when George Washington was here in 1850, he would have had an opportunity to see the Charter of Barbados, and the first 5 articles in the Constitution of the United States reads very much like the Constitution in the Charter of Barbados.
The signing of the charter at the Mermaid Tavern in Oistins is a really important step, not just in Barbadian history, but in colonial history as a whole, because of the relationship of the colonized to the colonial power. What essentially the Barbadians, and we must begin by that time to call them Barbadians, because they had begun to identify with the island itself as opposed to the home government, and that they were prepared to take a stand, just like in colonial North America. They were prepared to take a stand that was against the trend and the political reality of what was happening in England itself under the Cromwellian era. And it was a very bold move for them to take. Here is little Barbados basically holding themselves up to a commonwealth that Cromwell established in England. And then what was happening within the tavern itself was this amazing agreement between the colonial power and its citizens that had become to identify themselves as a people that were different from those that were at home, as they called it then. And so there are a number of areas where this activity, this action in Oistins is of key importance, not only to Barbados, but the relationship of a colonized group of people to their various so-called mother countries.
It's important historically, it's important for a number of reasons. And perhaps if I read directly from Donald Davis's book here, it's entitled The Roundheads and Cavaliers, there is reproduced in this volume the articles of the Charter. And there are a couple that are of greater importance than others. And certainly the first 4 articles of the Charter are quite important. Article 1 stated that liberty of conscience should be allowed on the island. Article 2 states that the courts of justice established here in Barbados should prevail and no undue changes to the laws of the island made. And perhaps the third, and for our purposes, the most important clause, and this is the clause that relates to the concept of no taxation without representation, and it's so important that I will read the entire clause here for you. 3, that no taxes, customs, imports, loans, or excise shall be laid, nor levy made on any of the inhabitants of this island without their consent in a general assembly. That laid the groundwork for arguably a number of anti-colonial struggles elsewhere, including, and I think one can find echoes of all the events that transpired here in 1651 and 1652. One can find them to some degree repeated later on in the American War of Independence, and precisely the same points that the North American colonists were fighting about 100-odd years later.
The other important aspect of this is not just the matter of the signing of the Charter, but it has been said that the Royal Navy, the establishment of the Royal Navy, its first sort of embryo in a way, was the forces that arrived off Barbados as a government-planned group of ships, a fleet sent out by the state to deal with a colonial situation. This was not a question of individual privateers, you know, from the time of Henry VIII being pieced together and under Elizabeth signing little documents, sort of merchant men that were doing a little part-time job for the state. This was a state-organized fleet sent out by the government to do the government's business in Barbados. And this is a key component of the beginning of naval power, not only in Britain, but the whole establishment of government naval forces in the world. So we have to understand that the fleet that arrived off Oistins was the beginning of a concept that the state funds its ocean forces.
One has to recognize that 1966 did not create the Barbadian or did not create the country that we call Barbados. 1966 was a formal act of our independence from Britain. But prior to 1966, there were many events that transpired on this island that came together and gelled and helped to create the Barbadian ethos that we know, helped to create the identity of Barbados. By the middle of the 17th century, one can argue that events such as the ones that we're discussing now already speak to the emergence of a Barbadian identity, and already to speak to one of the great truths of colonial activity, imperialism, that any colonized people are destined by the very act of colonization to struggle against that colonization and ultimately to achieve some degree, some modicum of independence for themselves. So is there a relationship between the events of 1652 and the events of 1966? And I would argue, yes, they are. And having personally lived through 1966 and been in contact with some of the thinkers of that period, the Right Honourable Errol Walton Barrow, Mr. Cameron Tudor, other individuals, they too were aware of this charter, and they too incorporated it into their political dialogue at the time, and they too referred to it in advancing the argument to the Barbadian people, establishing why Barbados should take that important step to move into an independent political status. So, stirring events, bloody events, lives were lost, events of heroism, of bravery, of fortitude in the face of overwhelming odds. But these events are little known, I think, to the Barbadian population of today. And I think that something like the anniversary of this important charter that we're celebrating here in this interview, I think that needs to be brought more into the forefront of the Barbadian consciousness.
Now, certainly something of this importance with such far-reaching impact should be celebrated here in Oistins Town. You might be aware that there's already the recreation of a Mermaid Tavern as part of the Cannon Collection on the compound of the Sedans Fort. Thanks to Major Michael Hartland and the Barbados Defence Force, they are to be commended for that. But certainly, this town cries out for a monument, if not the Mermaid Tavern, at least a monument in celebration of that important event which changed the course of history in Barbados.
Up to this present moment, there is no monument, there is no plaque here giving testimony to the stirring events that took place here. And I think it is high time that either the people of Oistins, the people of Barbados, or the government of Barbados agitate, come together and do something that concretizes this.
Oh, I would support it, and I would be there too. No, it's a historical place, and I'm really surprised that nobody has actually built another Mermaid Tavern. Its history is fantastic, and you know, the Charter of Barbados was signed there. So much going for it that really someone ought to look into it.
And of course, the site where such an event takes place is of key importance. I hope, as I understand, that some special monument or special site will be declared for where the independence of Barbados was declared in the middle of the garrison on the 30th of November 1966. I was up an evergreen tree looking at the event in the middle of the night, so I remember it well. But just as such a site needs identification, so too the place where such an event as happened at Oistins took place.
I would have to support that whole drive to recreate the tavern, the Mermaid Tavern, because not only is it the continuity that Barbadians today can recognize, we live it. It's not a changing one, it's one that has become a part of our fabric and way of life. And again, under the threat of being influenced by other countries, it is so important to try and either respect that past and the things that took place there and keep real what is Barbadian. You know, for that reason, if you go down there today, you might as well look present day, 200, 300 years ago, let it live on.
It is very instructive for the population of Barbados and in fact for the rest of the world that such an event took place in that spot. And therefore the rebuilding, the reactivation, the reconstruction from scratch of a replica of such a building and the activities associated with it would be of importance. And after all, Oistins has become known as a place of taverns and fish nights and all sorts of interaction and activity. And I am sure that even today, over fish on an Oistins table, many important political decisions of Barbados are taken. It would be apt that a tavern within that milieu, although historic and although recording a historic event, would fit in very well with the present day activities of Oistins.
Oistin have a rich and a long history. It was in Oistin, not very far from here, that the charter of Oistin, the Barbados Charter,
yes,
that was signed in Oistin.
Yes.
And a lot of people are still asking where, but we do not have a monument to depict where that was signed. So part of my endeavor now is to try to put that right.
So that not only we can profit from this constant reminder of the events that took place here, but that the visitors, and this is an important visitor spot, can see some of the history of the island laid out for them and be given an insight into the importance of Barbados over a long period of time in the anti-colonial struggle. So from many points of view, I think the events that took place there are of great importance.
A cannon in the sea, perhaps one of those that was turned inland and used to shoot the cavaliers. There's also the wall or remnants of the old fort here in Charlestown on Oistins Bay. Brave hearts might lose the battle, but invariably they win the war. For good fortune always favor the brave. There you have it, some stirring events that led to the signing of the Charter of Barbados, Thursday, January the 11th, 1652, right here in what was then known as Charlestown on Oistins Bay. Special thanks to Dr. Carl Watson, Major Michael Hartland, Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, Sophia Lewis, and the hard-working staff of the Reference Department of the Barbados Public Library. Special events preserved for you and for future generations in the archives of the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation. As we always say here, not to know what has been transacted in former times is to remain always a child. Ensuring that you do not remain always a child, this is a piece of our past. I'm Sherwood McCaskey.